Good evening, folks. We're still like new shoes. We're trying to fit into the new facility, but I want to give Doug Rainey and his entire group here at the History Center great compliments for helping this transition. Besides the two we have in the audience, do we have any World War II veterans in the audience here? Please stand up if you can. Take his name. This evening's speaker is Phil Padgett, who has published his first book called Advocating OVERLORD. This was a consideration that we looked at last May, and we rolled it into this year because of the implications that it has. And I will tell you that the program this evening will be a great complement to the Harold Deutsch lecture next month with Mark Stoller and his book that covers some of the same things, but in different way. And if you look on the back of Phil's book, Mark Stoller actually made comments to it. But Phil has studied history. He went to the University of Maryland. His most of his civilian career was a part of the arms control negotiations, and understands Washington and has uncovered a lot of documents. It's amazing. We say, geez, World War II, how can another book be published? It seems like there's always these untold stories, things that never get told. But Phil brought us this good weather we're having right now. You know that. He took credit for it anyway. But Phil lives in Kensington, Maryland. He told me today that as a part of his research on this book, he's uncovered some other information. So get to work on the book, Phil, and we'll have you out in 2 or 3 years. Phil Padgett on Advocating OVERLORD.
Well, gentle people, good evening, Don. Thank you for that nice introduction. Before Operation Overlord, the operation to liberate Europe from the Germans from the West could begin, the Allies needed a bunch of things. They needed a defined strategic goal. They needed a strategy for achieving that goal. They needed the concentration of armed forces to make that work. They needed a supreme Allied commander. A year before D-Day, which would have kicked off Operation Overlord, none of that had been agreed or created. Well, Advocating Overlord is the story about how in 1943, the Americans and the British argued vociferously about strategy alternatives, cross-channel invasion or coming up from the south through the Mediterranean, and how they came to agreement, and how over the course of the year 1943, from January to August, a separate, completely separate, equally difficult negotiation was sharing the stage with the strategy debate. And that negotiation was about allowing the British to rejoin work to develop an atomic bomb, which they had been basically shut out of at the end of 1942. We'll go into the reasons why. Well, Churchill, who was good at taking the long view, could foresee a post-war world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, both with atomic bombs, and he felt that Britain needed its own bomb for its independence. That was the word he used. But he did not want to do a cross-channel invasion. So these two issues, bit by bit, moved closer to closer until there was an apparent quid pro quo in which Churchill reluctantly agreed to the Overlord strategy and D-Day, and a few hours later Roosevelt responded by signing a secret agreement to allow the British back into the work to develop an atomic bomb, which by that time was known as the Manhattan Project. Well, Advocating Overlord is about that story, and you need to know that this is a somewhat controversial idea, although Mark Stoller read the manuscript and he didn't have a problem with it. But the evidence for this is all circumstantial, but there is a lot of it. And you can decide whether or not this makes the case. So the Allies came out in 1942 having put down the threat of their defeat in 3 crucial battles, Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad, which by January was just wrapping up. So they could begin to think about, okay, how do we win the war? And at that point, all the issues and their differences started to come to the surface. And that became a problem. For the Soviets, it was very clear. They were just ready to start advancing westward to regain occupied territory. In early 43, people were not yet concerned about where they would stop. They would become concerned about that later. But for the Americans and the British, there were significant differences, and they were real and practical differences of military operations. On one hand, the United States preference really had 3 points. Win the war as quickly as possible in Europe, pivot and beat the Japanese, and then come home. Well, on over 1943, that last point would change, too, in significant ways that affect us today. The British, on the other hand, with the memory of World War I and the terrible losses that all of the European countries had suffered in that war, and also knowing that their own military-age manpower pool was tapped out, and reflecting on the history of how World War I ended when the Germans, who had appeared very strong militarily, suddenly collapsed internally and sought an armistice. And adding to that the theories of aerial bombing that were prevalent at the time, the British were interested in what both the United States and Britain called an opportunistic strategy, and that you would pressure Germany all around the periphery and bomb and try to induce Germany to collapse. And then you wouldn't have to fight trenches in World War I and that sort of stuff. So there was a clear difference in the practical issues of strategy here, but there was a more basic difference. In the 20 years since the end of World War I, the cooperative relationship that had existed between 2 allies then had atrophied and become affected by sources of friction that would be very familiar to us today. A false sense, in each country, a false sense of having been taken advantage of by the other. Doubt about the motivations and capabilities of the other. And again, in each country, resentment about the protective tariffs of each other. And those were popular attitudes that infiltrated into the military leadership and resulted in a situation where they were reluctant to trust each other. And that got in the way of figuring out, okay, which of these strategies is the best one, and then cooperating to make it happen. Well, early in the war, the British and the Americans had set up an allied command organization called the Combined Chiefs of Staff that had its headquarters in Washington to run the war, and they would periodically meet. The British Chiefs of Staff and the new United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, they would meet along with Churchill and FDR in various places in the world to work out, or try to work out, some of these problems. And they gathered in Casablanca in January in North Africa, and that's when the strategy issues again came to the fore. And the Americans left that feeling that they'd been bested by the British, but the American Chiefs of Staff didn't know that there was another issue on the table between Roosevelt and Churchill to get to that. Now, the military people did make some important decisions. First priority for 1943 was going to be beating the U-boats in the Atlantic, and that fit any strategy. You had to be able to move supplies and troops across the Atlantic. They also approved what they called the Combined Bomber Offensive, with the RAF bombing by night and the growing 8th Air Force bombing by day, and the 15th Air Force later on coming in from Italy. And then really at the end of the meeting, they agreed to set up a joint planning group in London to figure out ways to re-enter the continent. Now, what the JCS did not realize in thinking the British had bested them was that other issue of getting back into cooperation on the atomic bomb had the British really worried. And the scientists in London had been sending frantic cables to Churchill, and Churchill went through Roosevelt's very close advisor, Harry Hopkins, to try to get back into this. And Roosevelt gave him kind of vague assurances, which Churchill sent back to London, but nobody really trusted that. Meanwhile, the American scientists believed that they were doing what Roosevelt wanted by kicking the British out of the project. So, and there were various reasons on both sides for this. On the surface, what the Americans told the British was, well, we're doing 90% of the work and making 90% of the investment. And just as we don't tell our military everything if they're not involved in an operation, or don't tell our contractors everything, there's a lot you don't need to know to do your small part. So we're not going to share that with you, which was a very large part of the project. But internally, the Americans were saying to each other that they had an evolving position. Initially, the American scientists, and you see there the three men there from right to left, there's Vannevar Bush, who was Roosevelt's science advisor, James Conant, who was Bush's deputy, and General Leslie Groves, who'd just been brought into it. Bush and Conant were worried that the British wanted a post-war advantage in generation of electrical power. But then the atomic pile went critical in Chicago, and suddenly a bomb is viable. And the British noticed there's a different attitude among the Americans. They're very much more conscious about security, and they want to share even less with us. So at that point, they started worrying about, well, should we share this terrible weapon with a foreign power? And the Army, on their part, they were looking towards an American monopoly. Now, both the civilians and the military were concerned about violating the war powers that Congress had granted Roosevelt in 1941. On the British side, they were pretty frank with the Americans. They said, we can't develop a bomb with our own resources before the end of the war, and we reject the idea of a need to know. Instead of that, they would say what, in today's terms, we say an obligation to share. So honor your promises. Internally, the scientists were feeding Churchill's concern about Britain's post-war independence and feeding him the idea that east of the Urals, the Russians could be developing a bomb, because Churchill was very anti-communist. So they were kind of stoking him up, and he readily met it. The man on the left is Sir John Anderson, who was head of the British bomb project, and they did important early work. Okay, the planning group that they'd agreed to in Casablanca finally got running at the end of April 1943. So time is moving along here. And they appointed a British general who's in the upper right, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, to head this project. And it's an administrative detail, but it becomes crucially important later on. Morgan reported to the British chiefs of staff because they were acting for the combined chiefs. Morgan got an American deputy, Bray Barker, who's down in the lower right there. And Morgan took his title was Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, even though there wasn't an Allied commander yet. He took the first letters of his title to spell out Cossack to name the group. And they were given 3 tasks, and it was in order of priority, which is interesting. First of all, feints and deceptions to draw up the Luftwaffe and engage them and draw down their power. And then second, plan for a return to Europe in case Germany collapses. That was called Operation Rankin. And then at the last, third priority was plan for a full-scale assault across into the continent for 1944. Well, Morgan, there are various people around London had been thinking about going back to the continent, and they all kind of gravitated onto Cossack. And in their first meeting, Morgan wanted to inspire them, and so these were younger officers. They weren't imbued with the distrust at the higher level. And so he ended his remarks with what General Alan Brooke, the top British general, had said to him at the end of briefing Morgan about what these tasks were. And Brooke had said to him, well, there it is, it won't work, but you must play well, make it. Well, Morgan's young officers, they took the challenge and they leaned into this with a will. They didn't know what the Allies' goal was specifically. Morgan ended up writing one himself. They didn't know where they would re-enter Europe. They were told, look from the Netherlands to the Spanish border. They asked, how many ground forces and air forces would we have? From the Combined Chiefs of Staff, silence. They didn't know how many ships they would have to land them and supply them, silence. And there was no strategic Allied commander to champion them when operations all over the world are competing for short resources. What they did know that there were people at the top who didn't really want their planning to succeed. That was a correct suspicion. And so they started out planning based on what they thought was required rather than what they thought they would get. Now, in May, the Combined Chiefs of Staff met again in Washington, and in Washington it was a very hot and humid time as Washington can be in May, but their negotiations were hotter still. They met in the Board of Governors room of the new Federal Reserve building on Independence Avenue. And 7 blocks away, Churchill and Roosevelt were meeting in the White House, and they had an agenda of their own to which the chiefs didn't necessarily have access. Now, the chiefs had a very tough time negotiating. The negotiations nearly fell apart several times, but finally they got a fragile agreement that they would make a cross-channel invasion in May of '44, the primary strategy. It would be called Overlord, and they agreed to move 7 combat experienced divisions out of the Mediterranean to the UK to beef up the forces for Overlord, the 4 American and 3 British. And so they go over to the White House with their draft agreement, and Churchill and Roosevelt say, that's fine. They agree to it. Churchill says, that's fine. Then they go back and have a very tough time, more arguments, getting to a final agreement. Come back to the White House, and this time Churchill rejects everything he's agreed to 24 hours earlier. Well, consternation. What's going to happen now? And people wonder, well, why did he do that? Churchill had 2 primary goals in going to Washington in May. One was his Italian strategy in the Mediterranean. The other was to get back into the atomic bomb project. And the night 2 nights before everybody left, Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's aide, went to Churchill and talked to him and convinced him, you got to do something here. And that precipitated a meeting that Hopkins set up the next morning between Churchill's science advisor and Roosevelt's science advisor to talk about atomic cooperation. And that clarified a lot of issues. They didn't agree on anything. They were at an impasse, but at least they understood what their differences were. And my contention is that getting that to happen may be why Churchill laid out his cards. Now, Trident didn't end there. Churchill, who was suspicious of the assurances he got about atomic weapons and also knew that General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, was his principal adversary and most effective adversary on a Mediterranean strategy, convinced Roosevelt to allow him to take Marshall with him on a flight across the Atlantic to Algiers, to Eisenhower's headquarters there. Marshall had been supposed to fly to the Pacific, but on 4 hours' notice, he finds himself on Churchill's plane. Well, Marshall knew what this was about. He knew what Churchill was going to try to do. But very deftly, he kept the conversation, deflected, and got through this without compromising his position or wrecking his relationship with Churchill. But that picture that you see there is an ambush. Now, the chiefs of staff and Roosevelt's advisors used to worry that Roosevelt would wilt under Churchill's sun lamp. And I picked that picture because it's warm Mediterranean light flooding in. You can see Churchill fairly glowing there. All the senior commanders from the Mediterranean just happened to appear at the headquarters that day when Marshall arrived. So the whole gang is there. And here's the British Foreign Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, he's there too, But Marshall held his own. But what came out of that is the JCS understood that the British commitments to Overlord were not to be trusted. And as it happened, a couple of weeks later, the British issued an order to their Mediterranean commanders, what they called a stop movement order, which meant to stop moving those 3 British divisions back to the UK for Overlord. And the JCS was incensed, but they basically were back to where they were. Cossack, in the meantime, has been working hard, finding solutions to difficult problems like getting enough supplies over the beach, a way to achieve air superiority over the Cotentin Peninsula. And they've developed what they called an Overlord outline plan. Now, an outline plan is really, although it is, it's about 50 pages, it's the summary. And this is what you use to convince the commanders that this will work. This is a photograph of their hand-drawn map of the Cotentin Peninsula, drawn into it, hand-drawn in colored pencil, British and American units. There are 3 beaches there, 1 American, 2 British, although it really be 1 British, 1 Canadian. And in green, cross-hatching, paradrop over around the city of Cannes and some commando operations at a couple of other points. And they put this forward with 3 achievable conditions: that there must be no more than 12 German division equivalents in France, in northern France at the time of the invasion, that the Allies have drawn down the Luftwaffe and have air superiority, at least over the Cotentin Peninsula, and also that the artificial harbors would work to bring in enough supply. Well, this was sufficient to get the chiefs on both sides to agree this can work. And that was a very important development because it changed the whole discussion. Instead of whether to do this, it became when. It had been easy to defeat the American idea of a cross-channel invasion when there was no effective plan on the table. Well, now that had changed. But something else was happening. The timing of this, as it happened, coincidentally, was very interesting. In Washington, the planners in the Pentagon were beginning to experience a crisis of confidence. They were beginning to say and produce papers that said, well, maybe the British plan for coming through the Mediterranean, maybe that's the bird in hand, and maybe that's the way to go. And they had an important champion in that, General John Hull, who'd been the original architect of cross-channel invasion. He agreed with them. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were fighting this down, and in the official Army history, this section is called Revolt Against Overlord. The British in London, they knew this was going on. So Morgan goes to General Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, presents the outline plan, and Brooke's response is, well, okay, that's good. Now send a team aboard the Queen Mary to brief Churchill on his way over to North America for this next conference that's coming up. But don't send this plan to Washington just yet. Well, Morgan goes back to his office. Of course, the Americans are outraged, and he's very concerned too. And they have a discussion, and he sends the team to brief Churchill, but he and Ray Barker together decide they're going to risk their careers. And they send a team of 3 officers sneaking out of London with copies of the Overlord plan to fly to Washington. And now they have some adventures on their way there. That's another story. It ends up taking a week to get to Washington. So a lot of things are happening simultaneously now. And this is getting to be a real crisis. This is what's going on, almost all of them simultaneously, on the evening of Friday, July 30th, 1943. Winston Churchill was preparing to sail to North America. The Prime Minister was intent on arriving early to win over Roosevelt to the British position on Allied strategy for victory in the War of Europe, even before the start of the Anglo-American Quadrant Conference in Quebec. Sir John Anderson, who I pointed out to you earlier, Churchill's head of atomic research, was flying to Washington from London to negotiate for British participation in the Manhattan Project. The new government in Rome, that replaced Mussolini was dispatching emissaries to find a way out of the conflict with the Allies. Joseph Stalin was pondering whether he could leave Moscow in the near term to meet secretly with Roosevelt. U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was flying back to Washington from his meetings in London and North Africa, determined to persuade FDR to insist that Churchill accept the U.S. military's position on strategy to win in Europe, based on cross-channel assault through Normandy, and further insist that an American serve as Supreme Allied Commander. And Roosevelt, the focus of the hopes of each, was quietly leaving town to go fishing. Well, there was method to that. FDR had not yet come out firmly in favor of the American option, overlord. And, of course, Churchill's on his way to put him under the sun lamp again. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of War, Stimson, Harry Hopkins, and other key advisors were very concerned that Churchill would sway Roosevelt again. So they took off the shelf a year-old proposal for a fishing trip up in Canada, and very quickly brought that about and made it happen. So FDR goes sneaking out of Washington. All of his trips were secret, but normally they would take aside a couple of trusted senior reporters and tell them, well, okay, the president's leaving town, it's sort of to this purpose very generally, everything's going to be okay, in case people started to worry. Not this time, they didn't tell anybody. Monday morning, the world wakes up and realizes that the President of the United States is not in the White House. And the rumors start. And they get wilder and wilder. And Steve Early, Roosevelt's press secretary, is desperate to issue a press release about this fishing trip. Roosevelt, 760 miles away from Washington, is getting all this, and he won't let Early release a press release. This is too much fun. And he was overheard at one point where he got the latest bunch of dispatches. He turned to his close aide, General Watson, he says, well, Pa, we sure gave him the slip good this time. But it was what was happening up there, there was a deeper significance to this. In addition to narrowing Churchill's opportunity to talk to Roosevelt, it had created an opportunity to bring Roosevelt around to firm support of Overlord. Because Secretary Stimson returned, President's gone, he writes a very forceful trip report and outlined what he wanted in that. But General Marshall, who controls the airplanes, won't let Stimson fly up to Canada to deliver it. Marshall had learned something from his successes and failures with Roosevelt, that the way to get Roosevelt to a firm decision that he would stick with was present him a well-written position paper on the issue when he was away from the White House and its distractions, preferably with Harry Hopkins present to discuss it with him. And the fishing trip provided the perfect opportunity. So August 5th, starting about 10 o'clock in the morning, 3 communications descend on Roosevelt up in Birch Island, this tiny hamlet. It's still remote today. First, Stimson's paper comes in by air courier. And then probably while Roosevelt and Hopkins are discussing it, because they tended to do business in the morning before fishing, a 3-part message from Churchill comes in and is taking advantage of the Italian overtures to try to get them out of the war. He brings up this idea of the Mediterranean strategy again, and we don't need to go in there. And he gingers up this description, talking about the collapse of fascism in Italy. He writes, every vestige has been swept away. Italy turned red overnight. In Turin and Milan, there were communist demonstrations that had to be put down by armed force. 20 years of fascism has obliterated the middle class. There is nothing between the king and the patriots who have rallied around him in rampant Bolshevism. Okay, that was kind of the tone of things. And he also said, well, if we go in, the Italians may help us and the Germans are elsewhere. Well, Churchill had the message sent through the United States Embassy over their circuits, and the U.S. ambassador in London was worried about this, and he had a sleepless night. He didn't think that this was right. So the next morning, he goes to Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, and Eden says, well, yeah, I mean, this really is an overstatement, and he shares the information they received from the Italians and also the intelligence that this idea that the Germans have moved elsewhere may be a deception. And so Winant writes a report to Roosevelt telling him, don't trust this. So within a few hours, Roosevelt has all three communications before him, and he can see that Churchill's, two from very trusted sources, Stimson, who he respected as having been an artillery officer in World War I, and Churchill, who he respected. And he can see that Churchill's logic is pretty weak here. And so Roosevelt comes to a decision about Overlord. But as he often did, he didn't tell anybody. Meanwhile, we're getting ahead here. So meanwhile, in Washington, while Roosevelt is fishing, the two issues have come up again on both sides of the river. On the Washington side, Sir John Anderson has arrived, and he and Vannevar Bush are negotiating to come to a draft agreement on atomic cooperation. And they're doing this by letters sent cross town by couriers. And they get to the point, and Vannevar Bush, at Bush's insistence, the substantive points on the agreement that Churchill wants are left for Churchill and FDR to decide. The only thing the two scientists decide is a mechanism for how to manage the cooperation. And Anderson signs off, says yes, he agrees to that. Across the river, the revolt against Overlord is being settled. The Cossack plans, as General Barker reported back to Morgan, in the nick of time. I mean, they landed at National Airport and took a car right over to the Pentagon, went right into meetings. So now, the American side, the JCS and the planners, they're united, and as Marshall put it, to go to Quebec in a spirit of winning. The only question is, where's Roosevelt's position in all of this? And so the train comes back from Canada on Monday morning. Hopkins takes a car across the river to the Pentagon, talks to Secretary of War Stimson, and tells him, we talked about your memo a lot, and I don't know what he decided. So that night, Stimson goes home to his estate up on the heights above Washington and has a sleepless night. Roosevelt, on the other hand, has had a report from Vannevar Bush that he holds all the cards on the nuclear side. So he has a peaceful night. So Tuesday morning, and Roosevelt wants to have lunch with Stimson on Tuesday. Tuesday morning, Stimson comes back, writes another trip report, more forceful, adds a recommendation that General Marshall be made the Supreme Allied Commander. And he goes over to lunch, presents this to Roosevelt point by point. Roosevelt says, oh, I've already agreed to all of this. Huh? And where did he do that? He did it up in Canada. Stimson's first paper and Marshall's strategy had worked. So now the question was, well, they go in and they meet with the JCS, and the president gives direction. And I can tell you, even 75 years later, you look at a dusty piece of paper and the United States president gives direction, there's an electricity to it. It's palpable. And he tells them, okay, Overlord's going to be the strategy under an American commander, and I want all 18 divisions in Britain ready to go before D-Day. Well, the question is, can he hold? Because Churchill's coming to meet in Hyde Park, Roosevelt's estate, as you can see on the lower left there. Now, at this point, each leader needs something in writing from the other. And Churchill thinks that the way to resume atomic information sharing is clear because his science advisor hasn't been straight with him. And he thinks that Roosevelt can again be persuaded to a Mediterranean strategy. And the night before he comes down to Hyde Park, he tells the Canadian Prime Minister of Roosevelt, he's a fine fellow, very strong in his views, but he comes around. What he finds when they go out to Eleanor Roosevelt's little retreat at Valkill, a place well worth visiting if you ever get to that part of the country. And that's a picture of her and Churchill at one of the two meetings there. They get there, and the two leaders go off under a tree, and he finds Roosevelt is very strong. He's talking in a way, he's taking leadership of the alliance. He's going to be the senior partner in this. And they want Overlord, they want it under an American, and they talk about atomic cooperation, but they do not sign an agreement. And Churchill tries to get Roosevelt to come back to Quebec with him, saying nothing will be decided till we get there. Roosevelt knows this is just an idea to get him alone for overnight on the train to try to work on him some more, and won't go. And he won't tell Churchill why he won't go. And Churchill, they get back to the estate, and Churchill gets out a sheet of number 10 Downing stationery and to write Roosevelt a note imploring him to go. Up at the top by the date, he writes, "Blenheim Day!" exclamation point. This is the anniversary of the first Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, saving the city of Vienna. Well, this Blenheim Day anniversary is not going well for Churchill. He ends up going out to a bench overlooking the Hudson Valley all night, thinking about things. And he had a lot to think about. This really is kind of an intersection between the declining British Empire and the ascendant United States. And he's thinking about the future, and he's seen the Overlord plan coming over on the Queen Mary, and he can see where, yes, this can work, and if I agree to this, I can get the atomic cooperation, and there can be a post-war relationship. So he goes back in the morning, as he wrote himself, feeling refreshed. And their second meeting out at Valkill, he's a different man, and things are much better. So up in Quebec, the combined chiefs are already meeting at the Hotel Chateau Frontenac, and it's hot and heavy arguing. But they come to a point where first General Brooke for the British leans back and he says to the Americans, "Our problem is that we're not trusting each other." And General Marshall responds, "We're not trusting each other." So the Americans make a concession. They agree to accept a measure of flexibility in plans for the future if events change. And the British rescind that stop movement order for the 3 divisions. And trust begins to build, and they can begin to make this work together. So August 19th, they take their agreement to Churchill and Roosevelt, and that's the way it's going to go. And several hours later, after dinner, FDR responds by signing a secret agreement with Churchill to restore cooperation with the British on the atomic bomb. There are also several other substantive points to it, that they won't use it against each other, which was never really much of a consideration. They will not use it against any other country without the other's consent. And they will not share information about atomic weapons with anybody else without the other's consent. So that begins to go. The Joint Chiefs of Staff realize that they've got an agreement. Now they need to seal the deal. And the way to do that is to get the American Army to the United Kingdom, to create a new fact on the ground with an invasion force in being. Well, they're facing a serious challenge. By this point, by late summer in 1943, they are short of where they should have been for the number of troops in Britain by over 1 million. They are 76% short of their goal. And they've got 8 months, given that at this point, D-Day would be May 1st. They've got 8 months to move over 1 million troops across the Atlantic and all the supplies and equip and train them for an invasion to be ready in time for D-Day. Well, to do that, first of all, the Allies needed dominance over the U-boats in the Atlantic. And this is, a sort of stylized map of the weight of movement going across the Atlantic to various places. And they could say that by late spring 43, they were dominant. Now, you see books now that say the U-boats were defeated in May of 43, but that really is hindsight. If you read all of their communications and planning, the people actually running and protecting the convoys were still very worried. The U-boats were still out there, and it was a huge effort to keep them under control, but they were doing it. Around the Atlantic Basin, there was a network of high-frequency defection finding sites to find the U-boats. They had periodic access to their coded message. In the middle of the ocean out there was beyond the range of most Allied planes, but they could convert B-24 bombers to very long range and closed what they called the mid-ocean air gap. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy also were operating little escort carriers, and that's one of the U.S. Navy's one, USS Bogue, coming off the Virginia Capes, coming back from a war patrol. And they were very effective against the U-boats, picking up on tips from the high-frequency defection finding. And you see down below is one of Bogue's victims from that cruise, U-118, which had been caught on the surface, and they've really got a sense of what that kind of engagement looks like. You can tell from the radical maneuvering in the submarine's wake. The carrier's planes would operate in a pair. A little Wildcat fighter plane would strafe the U-boat to suppress the U-boat's gun crew, while the bigger Avenger torpedo bomber would come in to drop a depth charge. And what you see is a splash from the depth charge, which is going to detonate in another second or so, and the U-boat's going down. You know, they rescued 33 submariners from that. But they can now, the Allied navies can provide the minimum of security to move what really was the flower of a nation's youth across the Atlantic. But the real challenge was more logistical. I mean, this is a lot of people, in addition to everything else, to move. Now, what had happened up to this point was troop convoys to Britain had stopped in fairly early in 1942, and troops moved over in liners. The Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth were fast, large, much faster than U-boats, so they would sail independently. The convoy routers called them monsters. There were other liners that also sailed independently that they called semi-monsters. But all of the monsters and semi-monsters together could move only a third of the troops that needed to be moved. So the Navy organized a series of 12 fast troop convoys to get the troops over there. And the ship at the bottom, the Susan B. Anthony, it's photographed off Boston. And if you look carefully, you can see it is packed with troops. Every open space on deck has got people standing in it. Now, mostly today we think we fly over to Europe for vacation or a semester abroad or something, and we think of the Great Circle route. Well, it's much more complicated with a convoy. The purpose is to get as many ships as possible safely from point A to point B, and you'd rather avoid U-boats than engage them. So this is a track for convoy UT-10, and their original course is the heavy line, and they were diverted 4 times to avoid U-boats. But the U-boats were out there and they were close. The convoy commodore and another ship heard German being spoken on the very high frequency radio band, VHF. Now, that's close. VHF doesn't travel very far. From a U-boat low in the water, that's pretty close. Now, these convoys were heavily protected. They had about 3 times as many anti-submarine escorts as a regular convoy, and they also would include an old battleship, or in lieu of that, 2 old cruisers. Now, were those really necessary? Well, there also was a German fleet in being, what Hitler called it, in Norway, built around the battleship Scharnhorst and Tirpitz. Fast, powerful, heavily armed. And the idea was the old battleships, if one of those came out, they would give battle to give the convoy time to scatter and hope that Allied air cover would come and rescue. This is the battleship Texas, which is one of the 3. There was the Texas, the Arkansas, and Pearl Harbor survivor, Nevada, who escorted these convoys. Fortunately, that contingency never got tested. Now, so you get to from the Quadrant Conference, up to that point, the number of troops U.S. troops in the United Kingdom has been pretty steady, except for some growth for the 8th Air Force, and then it ramps up fast. So by November, when Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff take a battleship across the Atlantic for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, Marshall can report to him the number of U.S. combat troops in Britain are about equivalent to what the British have. And it's growing fast. I'm not showing the troops coming out of the Mediterranean there. But by D-Day, they've exceeded their target of 1.4 million by an additional 100,000 troops. Well, think of it, if you look at this chart from Churchill's eyes, he's his own Minister of Defense. So he signs off on what the British do to house these troops, provide them training grounds, or whatever else. He can see that Overlord is coming at convoy speed, but inexorably. So he starts continuing to object to this idea in terms of the timing of Overlord, but he can't prevail. The die has been cast. So December 6th, Eisenhower is appointed Supreme Allied Commander. He brings his team to London, and things start to change. They absorb Cossack into their operations group, and they assign Montgomery to look with their battle experience in fighting and beating the Germans to look at the Cossack plan, and it gets radically expanded in scope and size of the forces, really sort of like Cossack wanted from the outset. I had this map created to compare the two plans. You can see in the gray right at the shore the 3 Cossack beaches and then the 5 beaches as D-Day was actually carried out and the increase in forces. So, and you also start seeing around London and southern England this new shoulder patch of chafe, which is, against under a rainbow of the colors of all the Allied flags and against the black night of Nazi occupation, you see the flaming sword of liberation. So, it's coming. Well, the old battleships, one by one, stayed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some of the destroyers that escorted stayed and would support the troops that landed on D-Day. The Texas had a particular mission. It supported Omaha Beach, but also the Rangers assaulting Pointe du Hoc. And that's a contemporary picture. Most of those craters are from the shells of the Texas. The destroyers provided critical support to the troops by coming in so close they nearly grounded and firing gunfire support. They lost radio contact, so they'd observe from the bridge and fire to where the soldiers were firing. And Nevada supported Utah Beach. And this is a familiar picture, but it links to the advocates for Overlord. General Handy, who was a principal advocate in the Pentagon on the Army side, and his Navy convert, Rear Admiral Charles Savvy Cook, went to observe, and they could have stayed safely 5 miles offshore on the command ship Anson, but they didn't. They went into Omaha Beach in the early hours when everything was very much in doubt. And they came back to the Anson to report to General Giroux, who was the commander of the 5th Corps and at that point was thinking of pulling everybody off. And they were able to report, as Handy reported to him, the only thing I can see that can be done is to push the does through far enough to get the beach out from under small arms and mortar fire because, as Savvy Cook describes it, this is carnage. And then they went back to Omaha Beach to observe some more. So by D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops thrust onto Normandy's beaches and landing grounds, of which 9,000 became casualties and about 3,000 died. This is Omaha Beach a day later. There are 15 landing ship tanks there, LSTs, start of the logistics battle, which is the really crucial one, to build this lodgment faster than the Germans can respond. And by this point, the Germans have a lot more than 12 divisions in there. They've done away with that criteria. But they build it up, and so after 336 more days of fighting the Allied armies from the West and the Red armies, end the war in Europe by defeating Germany. And with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th, Operation Overlord is concluded in victory. Well, while this is happening, the Manhattan Project is ramping up significantly. The British are making important contributions in the engineering and the math, and the level of effort is becoming really huge. In today's dollars, by fall of 1944, the Manhattan Project had cost $100 billion and was growing at a rate of $1.3 billion a month. Churchill and FDR signed a second agreement in September '44, which is later lost, which has an effect on U.S.-British relations. The bomb is, there are two designs. The gun-type bomb, they were so sure of success that they never tested that. That was released for combat, untested, and was dropped on Hiroshima. The plutonium bomb, which was an implosion type, was the real challenge, and that was what got tested at Trinity, and that was used on Nagasaki. Now, the political effect of the bombs, of course, is in terms of Japan's surrender, is still argued today. The Anglo-American team that picked the targets for the bombs applied the same targeting theory that had been used in Europe and not proven, which picked up on an interwar theory that if you bomb an industrial society enough, you can induce its people to cause their government to change their policy. And General Groves told the targeting team that the first priority was political effect. Military effect was secondary. That's not what General Marshall said. General Marshall wanted a military. He would have tested the bomb somewhere as a demonstration. But they went ahead with this policy the same as they had applied in Europe. And the influence on the surrender is argued today. There's no accurate estimate of the number of Japanese casualties from all of the bombing, the firebombing and the atomic bombs. Combined, it's somewhere between 300,000 and 900,000 dead, compared to, and this is a fairly good figure, 600,000 Europeans who died under Allied bombs. So you get to the end of the war where, there's a new future coming in Europe and a new integrated cooperative world order coming, and at the same time it's coming with the dawn of this new age of anxiety, nuclear anxiety, which we live with today. And that is where we are. Thank you. Any questions?
These are two very special people to me. I really appreciate them coming out this evening to tell their story. Harold Gifford is going to speak first. Harold grew up in Mankato. Were you kind of a troublesome boy? Were you a troublesome boy?
Were you a troublesome boy?
Not really.
Well, he had a brother by the name of Quentin who went off into the Navy and was on the battleship in Pearl Harbor. Giff, tell us the story about your interaction with Quentin as he went off to war.
I had a brother named Quentin who lived in southern Minnesota. I was born on a little farm down south of the country. And Quentin was born in 1919, my brother Earl in 21, and I ended up born in 1923. I lived on a little farm down in southern Minnesota. And during the Depression, farming went to pieces, and we moved into the little town of Comfrey. I was 9 years old at that time. And then at age 11, we moved to the town of Mankato, where I had my first airplane ride on my 14th birthday. And then the next year, in 38, I got 3 rides on a Ford tri-motor bike carrying a sign around town. But then, in about 1937, Quentin went into the Navy. And by the way, he was honor man of a company of about 90 troops there at Great Lakes, and so I was pretty proud of him. But he and I always had a good relationship. He always kept me out of trouble if kids were picking on me and stuff. But then Quentin was home on his last leave in the summer of 1940. The year prior, I had quit high school, went to work on a dairy farm, as I didn't have any money. Well, when Quentin came home on his last leave, 1940, he came to visit me on the farm, and he made me promise to go back and finish high school. He showed me the value of education. He had an 8th grade education. He took up typing, and he even got a better job aside from that scrubbing decks and stuff. So I listened to him. I went back, and I worked real hard in school. I was no longer the class clown. I took it very seriously. And unfortunately, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and Quentin was killed. And you may remember a couple years ago, they had a big celebration. They had returned some of his remains, and Don had a lot to do with that. So as a result of going back to school, in December of 42, they came around and recruited me for the Army Air Corps cadet program. That was all by virtue of my having gone back to school and worked very, very hard. So then I got into training in February of 43, and it took about, 15 months before I graduated as a fighter pilot. In those days, they didn't have all the necessary facilities for training pilots, so they put us in a college. I ended up in Kansas State, and that's why it took so long. So it took over a year and a half to become a fighter pilot. And then I was assigned as a fighter pilot gunnery instructor in Eagle Pass, Texas. That was in the, I graduated, 44 May. That was about in August when the war started winding down after D-Day and the air war. They were no longer training fighter pilots. So wouldn't you know, a fighter pilot being made a 3rd pilot on a B-29 bomber. And since the B-29 was such a revolutionary airplane with the pressurization and all the electrical, as an aircraft performance engineer and 3rd pilot, I had to learn to troubleshoot every single system on that airplane. As a result, it took another full year of training. And all of these things happened to me pretty much by chance, not by choice. So I ended up being completely trained as an aircraft performance engineer. We went over and landed on Tinian on the day that they dropped the 2nd bomb. So as far as the way it turned out, I never shot anybody, and I don't have any war stories to tell about being shot at, but I do have some adventures to tell you about things that we did. I was in a briefing for my first mission over Tokyo, and the flights took off real early. We had breakfast, as a matter of fact, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and word came to us that the Japanese had thrown in the towel and they wanted to talk. And there was one big happy night. So that was on the 17th of August, prior to September peace treaty. So in the meantime, the International Red Cross had gotten grid locations for the location of POW camps where a guy like my friend here was at. So we rigged up the B-29s to go up there and drop supplies to these people. And they dropped them in some kind of a barrel-like container. And we had to make several passes over the camp. And those containers were loaded with just everything you could imagine that a POW who's starving, need of medicine and stuff, and magazines. It was just something else. And by the time we finished our several passes over the camp, someone had gotten up on top of the building and scribbled, "Thank you." That was really an experience to see that. And then, as the Pastor Ken Beal mentioned at my brother's service at the chapel, that my brother Quentin was killed at the very beginning of the war, and on the last day of the war, I was flying in a B-29 over the battleship Missouri and looking down at the peace signings there. There was a little bit of a snafu. We were briefed to rendezvous at 7,000 feet. We got up there. That we were supposed to join our formation. Then we had a certain time that we were to fly over the battleship. But wouldn't you know, the weather was way below where we were supposed to rendezvous. And they had made no contingency plan. So we knew the time we were to fly over the ship. So we had about a half hour spare. So we went down on the deck and we just surveyed that whole area. And I'm telling you, it was a mess. It was a mess. Just imagine all those battleships, those bombers, those fighter planes and everything. Here and there you'd see a stone fireplace sticking up or a stone wall. And this is one of the guys that did all that over there. Okay. So anyway, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but
I wish you would expand a little bit on how you got the planes together to fly over. Describe what that looked like flying over the Missouri at that surrender.
well, I'm telling you, of course, we had no ability to maintain the original plan and join our squadron. See, we flew up single ship. It was 1,500 miles up there from Tinian. And so we knew we had about a half hour before flying over the Missouri. And as I told you, we went down and we really looked things over. But then as we flew over the battleship, I'll tell you, we were low enough that we could get a pretty good look at what was going on. They were sailors in their uniforms hanging from gun mounts and everything else. And the sky was literally an overcast of airplanes. They were every branch of the service that was over in that area had their airplanes in the sky. And then after that, I was able to fly with the weather recon, and I got a chance to spend about 10 days on Iwo Jima. We went up there to navigate those P-51s back from Iwo to Saipan. So anyway, I was then transferred to Guam, of course. But really, as I said, I never shot anybody. I never got shot at. But I will change that. I did get shot at. We were doing a practice bombing mission over Gilbert Islands or someplace that had been overpassed, and some trigger-happy gunner down there took a few shots at us. But we never did get hit. So,
Well, listen, we're going to move on to Bob. Bob was from the area. He was inducted at Fort Snelling, trained at Fort Myers, and then converted to B-29s at Alamogordo, New Mexico. He was a gunner on the great thing that never gets talked about or maybe recognized because we take for granted the airplanes we fly on. But the B-29 was the first pressurized plane. We see the pictures of the B-17, the B-24, the guys in their fleece things standing in the windows. In the B-29, they were computer run. Bob was one of those gunners. He had 10 missions, and first of all, Bob, talk about the operation of the guns in the B-29 on the computer.
Computer?
Yeah.
Well, we trained on 50 caliber at Fort Myers, Florida, and bang, 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 bang. On the B-29, it was computer because we were pressurized, and the guns, of course, were out in the open. The training manual of the computer was the first time I ever saw that word computer. We had to figure out what does they mean by a computer. And the guns were actually electronic, driven by a computer. We had a screen in front of us. The screen would give us the picture of the airplane. We had to know what it was that we were to shoot at. And then by size and by manipulating somewhat like a camera and punching in the airspeed that we had and the wind and everything else, then you could trigger it, and it would automatically compute the trajectory of what the guns would fire. I did notice one thing. We had incendiaries in there, and if it looked to you like that bullet was going right into the target, you were missing it. The gravity would, of course, had to be computed perfectly, but those bullets were actually going under the target, so I always raised it a little bit and gave it a little better lead. Yes, we hit a few targets.
In the 9 missions before the 10th mission we'll talk about here in a moment, did you ever encounter any attacks on your plane that you used your computer gun sights?
Once or twice we had a few shots. It was not often. The reason for that was in daylight, we were flying what we called a box formation, and sometimes these box on box on box on box. And we could not see underneath the airplane quite very good, and one of the ways of attacking a B-29 was from below. The Japanese seemed to prefer a head-on attack, but from below, where we could not see, it was always a dangerous spot. So in a box formation, you watch on the left, and I watch on the right to see what's going on below our neighboring airplane, not below ours, because somebody else was watching that spot for us. To be honest, a 50 caliber can touch them at 1,000 yards, and they were shooting 30 caliber. There was no problem.
Tell us about what happened on your 10th mission.
I didn't understand.
Tell us about your 10th mission.
10th mission? Well, the time is going rapidly here, so I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. The 10th mission was a night raid Tokyo. We got there about midnight. We got shot down at 1 minute past midnight. We were hit twice, once in the second, in engine number 2, burning ferociously in a white-hot flame, and hit in the tail. The captain decided to go to the target. We dropped our bombs on target and then got the signal to bail out. I told a group before today that on bailing out, getting close to the ground, I could see that the soldiers were gathering in a circle and they had guns with bayonets. The guns and the bayonets were not pointed at me as I came down, they were pointed at the crowd. I'm going to abbreviate quite a bit because it's a long story. But the next day I ended up in a some, is that what the information you wanted? Okay, I won't go any farther than that.
No, tell about the interrogation.
The interrogation started the next day. We were quite a group. I don't know how many because we were tied and blindfolded, but I felt I was in a big room, and there were many other people in that room kneeling in the same fashion that I was. And they would take us one at a time for an interrogation. After the interrogation, into another building, which were horse stalls, and the horse stalls had been converted to jail cells. And as the jail cells filled up and it started to become crowded, they came along with the names of the people that had been interrogated and so forth. Alphabetically went from A to H and said, we're taking you to a different prison. You'll get better food and you'll get treatment for your wounds. None of the 62 people they took out survived the war. But the cell kept filling up, and in the cell that I was in, we ended up with 22 people in about a 8 by 10 cell. It was a horse stall, is what it was, and that's where we spent the next 3 months.
What were some of the questions? What were some of the questions they asked you?
In the interrogation, the first questions were very easy: name, rank, serial number, where were you born, mother, father, what's your phone number at home in Minneapolis, and so forth and so forth. The third interrogation was the one that prompted the questions about our subject tonight. On that interrogation, they began with a little, we called it, I guess we could call it torture. And they wanted to know if I had ever heard or seen a great big bomb. And I said, no, but I haven't seen one, but I've heard of one. It's called a blockbuster used in Europe. And it's one bomb per airplane, and it destroys a diameter of about 1,200 feet when it explodes. They seem to dwell on this a little bit, and that torture stopped. Then they continued with some other questions. Have I ever seen a B-29 with one bomb bay? And I had, no. A B-29 with modified bomb bay doors? I said, no. Have you ever seen a big bomb that would fit in a big bay? No. But they were talking, we didn't realize till after the war was over that they were asking questions about possibly an atomic bomb. It just didn't dawn on us. Our speaker for tonight can probably answer those questions. No? Okay.
We'll get into that with the Q&A. Yeah. Did you ever get any of the parcels that were dropped from the B-29s?
Get what?
Did you get any of the supplies that were dropped to you?
Oh, yes. On the 15th of August, they took us out of these cells and brought us to Omori. You may remember that name. That was in the book Unbroken. We were taken out to Omori, and the B-29s came over after about the 20th of August and dropped all of these nice big packages of food, and we put on a lot of pounds because we had been starving.
How much did you weigh?
How much did I weigh? I don't know, maybe 100 pounds. It was estimated that we were within 3 to 4 weeks of death from starvation at that time.
Yeah. And Phil, that's the reason in dealing with Bob and the many prisoners of the Japanese that I interviewed here, the decision to make the atomic bomb all of them said we would not have lived many more weeks if we had not had a surrender. So whatever brought that is certainly a question.
May I say something? At the previous meeting today, I told about a question I had to answer once that said, what do you attribute your survival? And my answer was atomic bomb was one of the things, and the other was what I just mentioned to you. My last name begins with the letter M. May I continue?
Yeah.
There are a couple of other things which I'd like to tell you about. Your speaker tonight is aware of something that I did not know. The B-29s dropped leaflets over cities in Japan about 3 weeks ahead of a bombing. And the leaflets said, in 3 weeks, our bombers are going to visit you. Why don't you get out of town? And I was curious some time ago about whether these leaflets had been dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And indeed they were. So that we did give them warning that those two cities would be bombed. And I always thought no one would leave town because they just were not ordered to leave. And this evening, Mr. Padgett, you gave me a different answer. Would you please tell us what you learned? Can I do that?
Absolutely. I like to lose control.
Okay, well, I have to say, Bob, meeting you and connecting with you and connecting those two stories was worth the trip. The Kawaoka family, Los Angeles, California, American citizens all. There are 4 children. And the father, I knew Harry Kawaoka. I met him in the 1970s. He worked with my father for 3 years in Tokyo. And the father, after saving a lot of money, decided it's time to go back to Japan for the big family visit. So they sailed in November 1941. They were interned in Japan, regarded with great suspicion. His oldest brother was drafted into the Japanese army to serve in Manchuria. And Harry's father settled the family in Hiroshima. Well, there was a point in the summer of 1945 when Harry's father decided that Hiroshima's number was up. And I don't know why, but it could be the leaflets. So he moved the family out of the city and into the hills, staying with relatives. And then on the morning of August 6th, Harry's father and his middle brother were back in the city cleaning out the house for last time when the bomb was dropped. Harry and his sister went back to the United States, graduated from UCLA. Harry's very successful CPA. His mother, however, never returned from Japan. War is a very terrible thing. And I've met veterans from all the belligerents over the years, and the common denominator is we're all just ordinary people trying to get along.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but when I think of that exploding bomb and 100,000 people die in a split second, it does affect me. But when I found out that the leaflets had been dropped, it takes some of that edge off of your feelings. So I hope you appreciate that the way I did. I have a copy of one of the leaflets here, not Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but Tokyo was on there, Koriyama and a few other places. If you wish to look at it, I'll dig it out. One more thing for you?
We're going to, I do want to move back to Mr. Gifford. We're starting basketball season, right? Tell us about what you did in your book. Tell us about your book.
about your book.
Okay, one of the, I guess you might call unintended consequences of my service was that it launched me into a career in aviation. And I got back into fighters again, and I flew with the reserve back here in about 50. I went back in the active reserve. I got to fly the Mustang and the F-80 jet. And I flew that flying boxcar for 12 and a half years. That's what happened to my ears. They had engines the same as the B-29 engine, those R-3350s, one on each side of me, and they kind of took care of my hearing. But the flying in the active reserve got me into commercial aviation, and I went to work for a company called Gopher Aviation. And they would sell an airplane to a company, and then they would provide the pilot service. And that's where I came in when they sold an airplane to Bob Short, the owner of the Minneapolis Lakers. So the whole 59 season, I flew co-pilot on an old World War II DC-3, which was really ill-equipped for a lot of heavy IFR. And I was very fortunate I could go to games in Madison Square Garden, and the players would let me carry an equipment bag in, and I could go into sit by the bench with the players. And I remember Elgin Baylor, I'm sure some of you have heard of him, and he would go dribbling down the sideline, and he had this tick like this. He'd kick his head over before he'd shoot. And, of course, his players accused him of getting that tick from cheating in cards. They played cards on these long flights, like we'd leave the cities about 10 o'clock after a game and landed maybe Teterboro after stopping Dayton or Detroit. And so anyway, on January 17th, 1960, we took off for St. Louis, where they had a game, which they lost, by the way. And they had a game on the following day. This was a Saturday that we went down there. Well, after they lost the game, well, first of all, the captain, he had died of a brain tumor a few years after this, and he was a little bit out of character for the captain of an airplane with 23 passengers on it. And when we landed in St. Louis, he disappeared. He had his wife on the flight with him. And the weather was so bad, they were forecasting heavy icing in the clouds. And FAA said you shouldn't even be flying weather like that, especially with an old airplane like that. But he showed up, and he had already dropped the passengers at the terminal for dinner. And it's about 6 o'clock he showed up. And he came in and asked me if I'd filed a flight plan. I said, well, I've been trying all day to get a hold of you and cancel this flight because, in my opinion, I shouldn't go. Well, he went and called the flight service and filed a flight plan checking the destination weather only. And I tried to talk about it going, but he wouldn't listen. He was the captain. And I had flown an airplane twice the size of the DC-3 for a few years. And I was even an instructor in that airplane, but I couldn't fly captain in the DC-3 because I had to buy a rating in that airplane. It cost a little money. I was, 36 years old at the time, my wife and 3 kids, so I couldn't afford a rating. But I was extremely more experienced than the guy in the left seat. So what happened is we took off about 8 o'clock, and there was 3 quarters, 300-foot ceiling, 3/4 mile visibility, bad weather ahead of us. And wouldn't you know it, right after takeoff, we were already in the clouds. The lights dimmed in there, and then they flickered, and then they went bright, and then dark. nothing. I always flew at night with a flashlight on my lap. And I turned that baby on, and we didn't have anything really except the very basic instruments. No fuel gauges even, no navigation, no radio, no nothing. Well, I knew from the weather broadcast we'd be on top at about 7,000 feet, so when we got up there, I checked with the captain. He didn't have any plans, so I said, well, in my opinion, we should pick up the North Star and head north, because when I was flying jets, I come out of Oklahoma City, put the North Star in the windscreen, 45 minutes later, there's the city. So I figured that would be the best way to go, but we kept going north and north, kept going higher and higher. And I hate to admit it, but I had that DC-3 up to 17,000 feet without oxygen. And Elgin and these guys in the back were pretty much complaining. But we were topping the clouds and picking up ice. Windshield iced over, one engine started to sputter, and I got the controls, and I whipped that baby around, and I got the heck out of there, and pretty soon we're back on top of the clouds again, but to the north, to the south of the front. So now what do we do? Well, I had to come up with a plan, and I decided that we'd fly south for a ways yet at about 10,000 on top, okay? And then I had sort of a homing pigeon instinct about where Des Moines was, and I definitely wanted to avoid Des Moines because they had these big tower farms near the airport, and we didn't want to mess with them. So after I went further enough west, I figured down Des Moines should be off to our right, and we went that way for a while. And once we penetrated the storm, we had to go down to 4,000 feet where there was no icing, but it was snow. Now we're at 4,000 feet, proceeding in the direction of where I figured might be Des Moines. And before you know it, we're about 4.5 hours in the air, and there I see bright lights through the snow. Had to be Des Moines. There's no other big town around there. So now here we are. We flew north and using the magnetic compass, which was not too reliable, but after we'd been in the air about 5 hours, I become very concerned about our fuel condition. We initially carried 6 hours of fuel, so I had to come up with another plan. So I suggested to the captain that we make a gradual descent. Now, I knew from experience in the many, many instrument approaches I'd made that I should be able to see something on the ground at about 500 feet. That's pretty low. So I forgot to tell you, there was a 21-year-old kid on board learning to be a co-pilot on the DC-3. And he was shining the flashlight on what we had left of the panel. So I finally got the captain talked into it. I said, we gotta start a gradual descent to get down to where we could see the ground. I don't see any other hope, because if we lose the engines due to fuel starvation, we're dead. You know, from in the clouds, 1 o'clock in the morning or what. So I got him talked into it. Jim Pollard, the coach, he was kind of looking over our shoulders, and he recommended that you should listen to this old guy here. Yeah. And so Jim, with the flashlight, I told him, I said, now give me a tap on the shoulder when we're out of 1,000 feet above the ground. So I started descent, and for some foolish reason, I slowed the airplane way down because I thought if we'd hit something, it wouldn't be quite as hard. But what we did, we kept, I told him, I said, let me know when we're out of 500 or 600 feet. He tapped me pretty soon, says we're out of 600 feet above ground. And just then, I've got a window open on the side, and I'm looking out there for the ground, and lo and behold, I see a light at a farm yard. And now that I see where the ground is, I could get down lower. So I get down probably 150 feet. I was looking at a silo about my level, the top of it. And now, this is 1 o'clock in the morning. And we got 23 people on board total. And now, what are we going to do now? So I could see snow drifting through a woven wire fence. That's how low we were. Now, as a former crop duster pilot, I was used to flying close to the ground. That was very helpful. And pretty soon, we come across a blacktop road. It was like God provided us with a nav aid. Now we start flying that blacktop road. We're going generally north. Pretty soon I see a Ham's beer sign along the road. So I knew we had to be near Minnesota. And we had to be headed for a town where they sold this stuff. Well, now you got to try to put yourself in that cockpit. We're down to just maybe a little over 150 feet or so above the ground. It's night. It's approaching 1 o'clock in the morning. Here's all of a sudden the bright lights of this town. And I know we had to be very low because water towers are about 125 feet high. And I was looking up at that water tower. And you know what? I thought for sure now we're going to read the name on this tower and we're going to know where we're at. Well, you know, the snow plastered all the letters on that town except 2 L's. I had no idea where we were. Well, I'm circling the town round and round, and as we circled, I see this cornfield over here. And I told the captain, I said, this flight's over. We're going to put this baby down there and walk away from it. He had been a carrier pilot, and he wanted to find a carrier. Well, to him, the carrier was an airport. And again, the coach says, hey, you ought to listen to this guy. That looks like a good idea, that there's nothing going to bother us landing in that cornfield. Nope, the captain was the captain, and he said, let's go up the road. We'll probably find the airport or maybe better weather. Well, now, we've been in the air 5.5 hours, and boy, I tell you, that fuel clock started ticking pretty loud. But out we go on the road, about 10 miles north of this town, which was Carroll, Iowa. I lost the road. It made a hard left, I found out later. And now what do? I can't see. It's snowing. It's dark all over the place. And I asked the captain, I said, I've just lost the road. Have you got it? And he said, I got it. But he thought I meant the controls. And that's all he had was a control column. He didn't have the road. And this kid with the flashlight, he almost hollered. He says, Giff, we're going down. And that little gauge that says if you're going up or down, it's vacuum powered. It was going down. And when you're about 150 feet above the ground, you don't have much down to go. So I honked back on a column. I pulled it up, and now we're right back in the soup again. Now I got to use this homing pigeon instinct again to figure out how we're going to get back to that road. So I made a turn and a descent, and when I saw the ground again, I could tell by the fence rows that we had to be going south, so I went south for a little while, and I figured by now the road has to be off on our right. So you can understand what's going on in this cockpit here. We're kind of busy, but I found the road and we went back to the town, and now this guy wanted to land on a highway. I said, hey, no. I said, I wouldn't even land on a highway with this airplane in daylight because you can't see the power lines. I said, I hit a power line one time when I was crop dusting. It's not good. So anyway, here we are on the road back to the town. Now the place is all lighted up. They heard our airplane flying around there. And this is 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning. So anyway, the coach convinced him again, listen to this guy, let's get back in that cornfield, which we did. And I'll tell you, it was pretty quiet on the final approach. And we could see, although the windshield was iced up, I had to look out the side window to line up with the cornfield, you know. Well, then the captain says, that field ain't big enough. I said, I'll make a low pass. I'll drag the field and show you, which we did. We swung around, dropped gear. I don't think we could operate the flaps. Anyway, as I said, it was real quiet on the final. And when we touched down, the first thing I heard was those ears of corn bagging the bottom of the wing. And we made the smoothest landing. I think it was Elgin Baylor later said it was one of the smoothest landings he'd ever had. Well, imagine that nice soft snow and that corn to slow down. The tracks in the book, there's a picture of our tracks after we landed. We went the distance of about 3 football fields from goal to goal with the tracks. And now, once the engines are shut off, the loudest uproar you could ever hear, people screaming and hollering and that. They finally realized they were alive after 5 hours and 40 minutes. They didn't know if they were going to make it or not. Okay, well,
Well, the thing,
end of the story.
Giff has got a book up here about his experience of flying with the Lakers. So you can come up and see him later for that. I'm going to grab a mic, and I'm going to come up the aisle. I'm going to grab this one. Okay. You guys can share that.
I'm sorry it took so long.
It was just good to listen to you.
Good comedy routine.
Yeah.
Say that?
That was a great comedy routine.
Yeah. I have a nephew that whenever I start to tell a story, he says, Uncle, is this going to be a long story?
Okay, I'm going to come up the aisle here. Any questions on the cornfield or on any other topic?
I had a question for Mr. Padgett. Did you find anywhere in your research or writing on this book that there was a plan or any idea of dropping the A-bomb on Berlin?
Okay, that's a good question, and questions like that come up a lot, and the fact that it was used in Japan and not in Europe. I never found a plan to drop the A-bomb on Berlin, but I wasn't looking for that. But when I spent a lot of time looking at the theories of air power that were applied that resulted in the area bombings of Europe and how that translated. And that left me with no doubt that had the war gone on and the bomb been available, that it would have been used in Europe.
It's my understanding that General Eisenhower did not have a lot of combat experience, and you mentioned that Marshall was even considered for Supreme Commander at one point. Why was Eisenhower chosen, do you think? And secondly, what did Patton have to think about that?
Why was he chosen Supreme Allied Commander? Yeah. Okay, that was something that FDR debated a lot. And by that point, Eisenhower had proven himself, both as a military commander, having made some mistakes, and for his ability to lead an Allied army, which was critical. And FDR finally decided, and it was Stalin who pushed the question that the big issue in the Tehran conference, and Stalin coming in, he's saying he wanted to know the commander for Overlord. And basically the Russian position was, if you don't have a commander, it's not a real operation. And FDR promised he would give him an answer within 10 days. And so he ended up deciding that it would be Eisenhower And the reasons are a little complicated, but partly because the British were going to have a Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, because they had over 1 million troops in the Mediterranean. And so there were issues of who would be senior to who if they moved Marshall from Washington to London and Eisenhower back to Washington, and but it came down to that FDR felt that he wouldn't be comfortable with Marshall not in Washington, because Marshall, indeed, in addition to being, as Churchill called him, the architect of victory, he also was a master at dealing with Congress. So those were skills that FDR felt he really needed in Washington. So it went to Eisenhower.
Question here. Yes.
Looking at your map of the British opportunistic plan, possibly landing in Croatia or something like that, how would that have actually worked out as compared to what was finally done?
You remember I referred to General Handy in the operations division, and when he looked at that, the planners in the Pentagon concluded that if the Allies went up through Italy, which would have been the option, whether or not they got into the Balkans, that the Germans probably would be able to defend that area with the troops they had in place with minimal reinforcement. And for that reason, that was risking stalemate or incomplete victory. So, but it would have, the British idea was their preference was to go into the Balkans, and Churchill was looking ahead to the Russians and what the Western Allies' position would be at the end of the war. But in terms of the military practicality of doing it, and if you've been to that area, you can see the logic of it. This terrain was too hard.
Question here.
Yes. As far as the sharing the atom bomb secrets with the British, could you explain how they were initially included, but then apparently what was the process of them being not included? I mean, all the initial knowledge.
Well,
or a lot of it.
Going to the beginning, the British had done important early research in atomic fission and physics, and they were reluctant to share that with the United States. They kind of pushed back on the first approaches before the United States got into the war. But then they got in a serious way in early '42, and they were sharing, but the British made an inadvertent mistake. They sent as their liaison representative to Washington a man named Wallace Akers, who had been a vice president of engineering for Imperial Chemical Industries. And that's what led the Americans to be suspicious that the British wanted a post-war advantage. And having read the papers of all of them, I think they also felt a little intimidated by Wallace, who was a pretty effective guy and very erudite in his dialogue. So initially they had made important contributions, but then the Americans ran away with it and decided we're going to try to go it alone.
Also, have you seen the kind of recent movie called Churchill, and what did you think of it?
Which movie?
Churchill.
Yes.
It just came out
Which one? There have been a couple.
Well, the one that just came out last year. What did you think of?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was pretty good. But talking with one of my British friends who's written a book on the Churchill and the bomb, he thought it was kind of so-so. So, I guess it depends who's looking at it.
Thank you for your excellent program. On this decision to drop the bomb on Japan, where do you come out on the controversy? What is the controversy, and what is your feeling about it?
Well, I'll confess to a bias. My father-in-law was a young Marine on Okinawa and slated to go in the invasion of Japan. But the bomb was dropped, so instead he went into the occupation of China, and I married his daughter now, decades later. So, But there were other pressures on Japan. The firebombing was really hitting them hard. And also the submarine blockade and the dropping of sea mines to increase the blockade of the home islands. And, people were going hungry, and they were really running out of stuff. It was pretty grim. Look at the history of the Toyota company, on what was going on there. They were basically working for the survival of the managers and workers more than anything else, and were forced to take farmers and school children and prostitutes as workers, and Japanese society was really imploding in a lot of ways. So there was a thought, and I know that U.S. Naval Intelligence had sent a mission thinking that they could get negotiations, and they thought they were weeks away from a solution. Now, nobody's ever really dug into that and verified it, but the gist of it is there are a lot of different theories about how the war could have ended, which didn't necessarily include the bomb. I think at the end of the day, the bomb was the psychological shock that really mattered, particularly to the generals who might have forced the emperor to continue and suddenly didn't have any grounds for their case.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question. The artwork on the cover of your book, would you tell that story?
Oh, yeah. Some of you may recognize that artist. That is a painting by the American artist of the 30s and 40s, Thomas Hart Benton. If you've been down to Jeff City, you may have seen his murals at the Missouri State Capitol. And he painted that on contract to the government on the docks in New York in 1943 when the troops were loading up. Well, my book spends a lot of time, and you saw the slides, talking about the surge of troops, most of whom left from New York in 1943. So I had seen that when I was deployed to New York for Hurricane Sandy on my one weekend off in 7 weeks, and I happened to see the painting, and I was very impressed with it. And the painting's almost as big as that. And only 5 years later, when I finished the manuscript, I said, that's it. That's the one. That's the cover.
Well, listen, we're going to stop. It's a little after 9. We've committed to the Historical Society. Phil, thank you for coming out. Bob, Quint. I'm too close to your brother. Harold, Hal. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We will, the program next month is on the Harold Deutsch Lecture. So look forward to seeing you here or at the Carpetbagger program on Thursday the 24th. Thank you, and have a great night.
They loved it.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.